past year, what you've got is a drawdown of all financial assets. So the NASDAQ is down about 22% over the past year. And so NASDAQ represents tech companies and all the risk assets. But on the other hand, if you were to go and look at like the bond market and the bond portfolios, bonds are down, like the BOND index, the long bond index, it's down almost 17% in the year.
Oof.
So for 30 or 40 years, you had this 60-40 bond portfolio. And the idea was
bonds were considered a safe space.
The idea was if stocks work, then bonds will be a low return and stocks will be a high return. But if stocks trade down, people will shift their money to bonds, and the interest rates will go down. The bonds prices will go up, and you'll actually get a yield on your bond portfolio. But of course, that broke around March of 2020. And the reason it broke in March of 2020 is because interest rates got pegged to zero. So after we had lowered interest rates from 5%, 5.5% to 5 to 4.5 to 4 to 3.5 to 3 to 2.5 to 2 to 0. They're trying to use monetary policy to counteract the negative impact of fiscal and foreign policy and domestic policy.
But what is the negative impact? Is it people just pulling back and not spending money? It's going to be important to get where I think we need to go. It's going to be important to understand why this stuff happens.
When a government declares a war, they basically put public policy initiatives ahead of the interest of the free market. Right. So if I declare a war, I could just draft every single adult in the country, put them in the military, send them off. And if I lose the war, they're all dead. Right. What's it do to the economy? The economy crashes. Right. What's it do to the prices? Well, price of everything go up. If you want to create inflation, you do it a couple of ways. Either you cut the supply, or you cut the supply of the product you want to buy, or you increase the supply of the money that's available to buy it with. So if I make it illegal to manufacture food, the price of food's going up. Right? I don't even need to print more money. Right? I can create inflation just in a war, like in World War II. We have gas rationing. You have food coupons. Why? Because all the gasoline gets shipped off to Europe to put in tanks or to put in airplanes or put in ships. So when you have policies that are declaring a war on something, you divert resources. So we had a war on COVID. We have a war on carbon, an energy war. If I decide I don't want you to burn coal or oil, then I drive up the price of energy. If I decide I don't want you to show up in your office, I drive up the price of production. If I decide that I want to fight this COVID war, and I'm going to change the way the economy works, then I'm going to drive up the cost of everything else. So we've got lots and lots of wars, right? You've got a culture war, you've got a war on office work, you've got a war on carbon, you've got a war in the Ukraine. The war in the Ukraine has escalated, right? It's not just a war in the Ukraine. It's really a kind of a quasi-economic war on Russia. So when we actually imported Russian sanctions, we cut the amount of gasoline or the amount of fuel available in energy. We drive up the price of energy. So every single time you actually put a public policy in place, you create inflation. Policy is inflationary. The more policy you have, good. The road to hell is paved in good intent, right? People get into positions of power, and they want to do good, and so they do good by issuing edicts, executive orders, policies, regulations. and they think that the regulations will make things better. They believe that if you enter into government and politics, you believe the political process is a way to make the world better. So what you have is political organizations, centralized organizations, getting progressively more powerful. And as they get more powerful, people do things, right? And I think if you roll the clock back to Ronald Reagan, he would say, government's the problem, government's not the solution. So let's take nuclear energy, right? The cleanest form of energy is nuclear energy. It's the cleanest, probably the safest. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island. We can't hardly trace a death from nuclear energy in the U.S. And yet we haven't built a nuclear power plant since the creation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission 50 years ago. And in Germany, they shut all theirs down, right? And in Japan, they shut all
human
theirs down.
psychology?
GDP measured in nominal terms is a gross distortion, and then CPI is a gross distortion. If I have 100 things that you want, and I pick 10 of them, and I measure the increase in the price of 10, and I ignore the price in the other 90, I can show you CPI is 8%, right? 8.3% is the number this morning. But the actual inflation rate is higher, but it's inflation on something, it's inflation on something you want, but I'm not going to choose to measure. For example, the 30-year bond is traded up to 350 basis points, and it was 180, right? Mortgages have doubled. So mortgages have doubled, housing prices are up 35%. And that means in theory, the cost for you to actually buy a home is going to be 50, 60% higher year over year. But I don't choose to measure it because we don't actually calculate CPI that way. I take a survey and I ask you whether or not you think you could raise your rent by something. And if the owner equivalent rent is up 3%, and I say that the inflation is 3 or 5. So we have a set of metrics that are just manufactured metrics, and then we focus on them, and then we talk about them. But ultimately, what you have is an economy that's distorted. There are some things we produce more of, and there are some things we produce less of. And we have flexibility with what we choose to measure. The monetary intervention is the government basically, if I put everybody under home arrest for a year, it's going to be a problem for the economy, right? I mean, if I shut down, they did it in New Zealand, they did it in Australia, they did it in Canada, they kind of did it in certain states in the US. If I do that, that cripples the economy. So while I'm doing that, then if I go ahead and I pump a lot of money in the system, right, then maybe I create a wealth effect and I can say, well, we're recovering.